What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number, well, this is actually kind of a special edition, actually. So Luis couldn't make it on the show this week. He was sick. And I used it as inspiration to finish a project I've been working on for a really long time, over a year and a half now. And this is post-produced content. This is something that I've been experimenting with and wanting to push in a direction on. And so what I did is I sat down with Hall of Famers William Huey Jensen and Ben Stark, and I tried to answer the question, what separates players of their caliber from the next level down, really good players. And I figured it might be useful for you as a listener to say, all right, let's just look at the very top. Let's look all the way to the very top of the mountain and see how these players think and how they approach the game. And so that's what I ended up doing for this. I'll give you a little bit of a behind the scenes after the special edition's over. But before we get into the actual meat of it here, I want to thank our sponsor channel, Fireball.com. Make sure that you check them out for everything you need Magic related. And of course, you for supporting the show via the Patreon. Channel Fireball and the Patreon are the ways that we get to experiment and push the boundaries for episodes like the one you're about to listen to, because I'm trying it. We'll see if it's good. I really hope you like it, but I couldn't do any of it without you supporting the show and without Channel Fireball support as well. So thank you very much to both CFB and to you, the listener. And I really hope you enjoy this. Here comes LR Special Edition number 1. The question: what separates the best Magic players in the world from the merely great? What's the difference between the Hall of Fame, Platinum, and Gold level players who are able to perform at a consistently high level and the players who can't seem to stick? What about the difference between the great players and the truly elite? If you've worked hard on your game, you've probably hit a point where you feel like you're pretty good at this. You make good plays, you have reasons for what you do, and you try your best to minimize mistakes. Maybe you've even played on the Pro Tour or had a deep run in a GP or played in a lot of RPTQs. What would it take to get you to that next level? What's missing? What is the makeup of an elite Magic player? I'm Marshall Sutcliffe, and I'll be your host today as we explore these ideas together. We'll use a sort of modified scientific method approach to find a reasonably logical conclusion. Since there won't be a definitive answer for something as, human as this, we'll be asking two of the greatest Magic minds of our generation to help us along this journey. Ben Stark is considered a limited master, but ask any pro and they'll tell you he's just a Magic master.
I'm Ben Stark, PT Paris champion. I'm in the Magic Hall of Fame. Won Grand Prix Indianapolis in 2012. 4 Pro Tour top 8s. Been playing Magic for 22 years.
William Huey Jensen is a legend of the game. He has dominated in 2 completely separate eras, proving that when he wants to be, he's truly one of Magic's elite.
Hey everybody, I'm William Jensen. Most people in the Magic community know me as Huey. I was inducted to the Hall of Fame in the class of 2013 with my good friends Ben Stark and Luis Scott-Vargas. I've been playing Magic since about summer 1997, so it's going to be 20 years, about 19 years right now, almost exactly. Going to be 20 years soon. Wow, I'm old. I was about 15 at the time, I guess.
By going straight to the top to find our answers, we'll build a picture of what it looks like to be one of the best in the world. We'll figure out what kind of person you have to be to get there, how they went about getting there, and if we can get there ourselves. As I pondered this question, my mind first went to the simplest answer. They're simply smarter. The best players in the world are super intelligent people who have chosen to apply their intelligence to Magic. Magic is a mental game that tests intelligence on many levels, so it would stand to reason that the best players in the world are highly intelligent, right? So we'll start with the intelligence question, because if it's simply a matter of they're smarter than I am, then we needn't go any further, since presumably you can't change your own base intelligence level significantly. Either you're highly intelligent or you aren't. So, how important is intelligence in Magic? I asked Ben Stark this question.
It definitely helps. I I don't know, I don't think I'm as smart as those guys like Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking. Intelligence certainly correlates to how well you're going to do in Magic. Ability to understand things, especially new situations, and figure out the best solution on the fly. It's a kind of skill that lets a great player differentiate themselves from a good player, because somebody maybe who's, smart, but a little less smart might be able to learn through repetition and then, put that into play. But when you learn the skills through repetition, those are only good like maybe 80 to 90% of the time in Magic. Then there's the 10 to 20% of the time where you have to do the opposite. The smarter you are, probably the better you are going to be at figuring out, when that 10 to 20% of the time where you shouldn't do what you learn through repetition, where you should go actually directly against the rule or whatever. So, I can't say that intelligence isn't going to help you do well in a strategy game based around constant, just like logic and strategy and math and adjustment. Of course, intelligence is going to matter. I don't think it's the only thing, but I do think that, you could draw a positive correlation between the more intelligent somebody is and the more successful they're going to be on the Magic Pro Tour.
Clearly, intelligence matters and will be a factor in how good you can be at Magic. As you'll often find when you set out to answer a complicated question like the one we're embarking on today, the answer is also complicated. I wouldn't expect that we would get a clean, one-concept answer, and we won't be getting that today. The key for us is to decode how much weight there is on each of the factors that we end up accepting. Intelligence does seem to carry a big part of the load, according to Ben. That wasn't the end of his take on it, however.
I don't think somebody with, let's just say, 150 IQ is just going to be successful at Magic and someone with 130 IQ isn't, or somebody with 130 IQ is and someone with 110 IQ isn't. But I do think there's going to be a positive correlation between, how smart you are and how successful you are on the Magic Pro Tour.
Huey had a similar, if more nuanced, take.
I don't think people are born with the ability to play Magic or play chess or play a guitar. I do think intelligence leads to Magic success, not necessarily because of a direct correlation. If you're smart, you'll be good at Magic. I think it's more along the lines of, if you take, I'm not talking about myself, but if you take anybody who's a smart individual and you teach them to do something, in general, they're going to perform better at it, especially if that thing has to do with a battle of wits and a battle of intellect with other people. I think in general, the smarter a person is, the more likely they're able to learn that thing at a high level.
Intelligence matters. But are there other factors related to intelligence that could contribute? For example, the age at which you start playing the game. We all start playing at different times in our lives, but there's a lot of evidence that things we learn as children are retained differently than things we learn as adults.
Do you think that that's like a brain, like a human brain thing?
I do. I do. I legitimately think it is. I think it's a human brain thing. Let's do a test right now. Let's say the 5 best players in the world right now, right? We'll say Owen. He's been playing since he was 14 or 15. Reed's been playing since he was 5. Ben Stark has been playing since he was like 12. 10, sure. Yuya, I really don't know, unfortunately, about his background.
I checked on this. Yuya started playing at age 12.
And the 5th best player, who knows? Luis played very young, I think. John played very, very young. And these people are super duper smart. These are geniuses, but they still, I know a lot of very, very, very smart people who started playing Magic at 24, 25, and they're good, but they're not John, they're not Luis, they're not Reed, and they're not Owen.
Yeah. Huey has some personal experience with this as well.
Even in my own career, I sort of took a long break from playing competitive Magic, 5-6 years. And when I came back, it took me a while, a year and a half to get back to where I felt like, okay, now I'm back. Do you know what I mean? But if I hadn't played Magic during those years as a child, I don't think, not only would I not have been able to get back to that point, I wouldn't have been able to get to that point at all.
This brings us to a big question. If intelligence is one of the central pillars of being an excellent Magic player, are there exceptions? And what do I do if I'm not in that super high tier of intelligence? Aren't there people who are great at Magic, but perhaps aren't in that uppermost echelon of intelligence?
I know people who, for some reason, they might not have been able to do advanced calculus, but when it came to Magic, when they looked at a board state, when they looked at 7 cards, it just clicked. And they played great. And they played as well as the best players, even though, they're not going to win a math contest against many of them, but who cares? When it came to Magic, they could do it. And I believe that, yes, I do think it's possible, and I have seen it.
So, like most things having to do with human beings, we see a general take, but also note that there are exceptions. Our first hypothesis was based on intelligence. What did we learn from it? We learned that intelligence is, in fact, an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to deconstructing what makes an elite Magic player, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the story. All in all, I would put a lot of weight on the intelligence aspect, but let's also remember that you need a strong baseline level of intelligence just to be able to play Magic at all. Magic is hard, perhaps one of the most strategically challenging games ever created. If you're here listening right now, you're probably in a good spot as far as intelligence goes. Let's call it one of the essential building blocks on which to become an elite player. It's a necessary part of the complete picture, but it's not the only factor. There are other factors that help make up the profile of an elite player. What are some of the others? In our next section, we'll tackle one of the biggest cliches ever. You have to work hard to get what you want in life. Yawn. How many times have we heard a version of that phrase growing up? Heck, a lot of people tell us when we are young that hard work is all that matters when it comes to being successful. Like many cliches, it's become popular because it's largely based in truth. It's great general advice after all. At most reasonable life endeavors, putting in a ton of raw effort actually does go a long way to being successful. It's also become so utterly cliche at this point that saying so simply has zero impact. Still, it's good advice if you actually take it, right? It's easy to imagine that most people would be able to meet their goals with a ton of hard work. But we aren't talking about most people here. We're talking about the absolute best Magic players, the elite. How important was hard work for them? What does hard work even look like to a professional Magic player? If you heard one of our guests say, "I had to work really hard over my career," would that stick with you in any meaningful way? That's the kind of cliche I'm talking about. That one sentence may account for a big portion of the reason why the top players are who they are, yet it's so easy to ignore. Today, we won't be ignoring it. We're going to do the opposite, in fact. We're digging deep into the details in order to really understand what kind of sacrifice you'll need to make to get to the highest levels of the game. Let's start with Ben's journey. I asked him what role hard work had played and how much time and effort he put into Magic while he was on the way up.
When I was a kid, when I started playing Magic, I was 11 years old. I was just eat, sleep, and breathe Magic. And then I got to pretty much the exact point you're describing where I was like a pretty good PTQer, but I wasn't having any success on the Pro Tour when I would qualify for it. And I definitely wasn't nearly as good as I am now, or as I could, had the potential to be. The main thing was, everybody around me was playing the game, do the most on board, use all your mana, attack with your creatures if they're not going to block, don't chump block if you have a high amount of life. The things that separate a good player from a beginner, I knew all of, and I, like I said, I was eat, sleep, and breathing Magic, so I never forgot a creature at first strike. I never made mistakes like that. But yet I still wasn't having success on the Pro Tour. And the reason I'd say would be the counterintuitive stuff. That's the stuff I learned from watching Neil.
That's limited standout Neil Reeves.
Whereas, it doesn't come naturally sometimes to not do as much as you can, to wait 2 turns to find out if they might have this powerful card, because you might have this other, line of play that allows you to beat that if you miss a couple damage this turn. You know what I mean? Here you are on turn 5, and you can make the most profitable play, but then, you're more vulnerable to some 6 or 7 mana card. And there's all kinds of things like that in Magic that are counterintuitive. That's what made the game so great. You couldn't just learn it and, you know it all and you're done. You know what I mean? You would have to learn those basic rules like, not chump blocking when you're high in life and using all your mana, as opposed to not. But then there's exceptions to those rules, and they're not 1 in a million. They're, like I said, maybe 10% of the time or something like that. So, if you're just always jamming the 80% or the 90%er, you can be good, but you're not going to be great. If you want to be great, you need to be thinking, you need to not just be casting your 4-drop over your 3-drop on turn 4 because it uses more mana. You need to be thinking like, okay, my baseline here is cast the 4-drop. Would casting the 3-drop here be better? Most of the time you cast the 4-drop, but when you identify that 10% of the time that it would be better to cast the 3-drop, and then you do, that's win percentage, and this is a game of narrow edges, and, small amounts of win percentage really add up. So, the advice I would give would be like you talked about with deliberate practice, would then to get over the hurdle from good to great would be to try to identify the areas that maybe are counterintuitive or that maybe go against the grain. You definitely don't want to go against the grain just to do it. You know what I mean? 90% of the time something is right. That means you ideally want to be doing it that 90% of the time. So, you don't go, oh yeah, I'm the guy who casts the 3-mana card when I have a 4-mana card in my hand on turn 4. That's a way to go from good to awful. You know what I mean? You go from good to great by casting your 4-mana card 90% of the time, but figuring out correctly or as close to correctly as possible the 10% of the time where it's right to cast the 3-mana card. You go from good to awful by casting the 3-mana card every time,
Deliberate practice is a concept that I introduced into our conversation. It's the act of not just simply doing a thing over and over, but actually concentrating on specific aspects of it and getting those as perfected as you can. This is much different than simply playing as much Magic as you possibly could. I asked Ben if he thought this was the right approach.
It's absolutely the way I would recommend approaching it. I feel like that was what I was just describing without even being familiar with the term deliberate practice. I'm saying you can't just play a lot of Magic and be like, oh, I'm going to be great. You have to play a lot of Magic, have maybe you thinking about and friends who are better than you or friends who are about as good as you but are good, telling you the areas where you think you're weak, and then you have to deliberately try and improve in those areas. As far as myself, I know I didn't really have great coaching when I was coming up. There wasn't really the information that there is now. I started playing Magic in 1994, and I played my first PTQs in 1998. And back then, there wasn't Magic Online. There wasn't this, plethora of information all over the internet.
So for Ben, it was a combination of both traditional hard work, that is, putting in tons of hours and repetitions, combined with intense study at the knee of players who were better than him. His own form of deliberate practice. I asked Ben if he thought the hard work aspect was critical to success at that level.
There are, a lot of people who are not as successful in the Pro Tour who might be more talented than others, might be more intelligent than others. But if you're only going to play, 10 hours of Magic a week and someone else is going to play 50, then you're not going to be as familiar with everything going on. And also, when you talk about putting in work, it's not just getting familiar with the latest cards in the decks. You have to develop your skills. If you just think, a lot of people, especially even really smart people, have problems with this. If you just think I'm smart and I'm practicing, so I'm going to do well, you'll do okay. But to really reach that LeBron James level or, the comparison in Magic, you've got to analyze your own game. You've got to have self-awareness. You've got to think okay, I'm smart. I understand Magic. I'm practicing a lot. What are my flaws? What are my weaknesses? And, I think people tend to focus on the areas they excel. And I think really if you want to be the best, if you want to be really, really good, reach your best, you need to think okay, I think I'm pretty good at draft. I think I'm pretty good at, in-game play when I'm behind. But I feel like I lose some more games than I should when I'm way ahead. Where am I maybe giving up a little bit of value in those types of games that are letting other people come back in? Maybe I'm always used to jamming the play that does the most on board, and maybe once you're ahead by that much, instead of doing that, there's different plays that become right because they take away specific outs. And because you're in such a favorable position, you don't need to just continually do the most damage that turn or things like that. You need to take away these specific outs because they're your opponent's only ability to win. Even though you're smart and practicing great, maybe you have this one little leak that intuitively to you, you're always jamming the most valuable play in a vacuum. And so maybe that's your weakness and you identify that and then you work hard at it and then you become a much better player by shoring up that weakness. You grab another couple win percent, which is everything in Magic. You look at the all-time win percentage list, and lots of pros win, 58%. The good pros win 60, 61. The best of all time are winning 65%. And maybe 2% of that 4% difference between a good pro and the best of all time is shoring up that leak.
I love this mindset. Not only is Ben advocating for working hard generally, he's also getting right into the nitty-gritty of finding your own weaknesses and shoring those up to open up those last few points of win percentage. I asked Huey for his take on this whole hard work thing as well. First, I asked him if it was important to have been playing for such a long time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when somebody's been doing something for 15 years and you've been doing it for 15 months, you just can't, it's almost impossible to be on their level, right? Of anything that requires repetitions. If you're talking about long distance running, physical things, sure, if you just have it, you have it. But with the stuff that you have to just decipher and problem solving and see repetitive situations, and Magic has really, really tough concepts. Tough enough that sometimes I find I'll see a board and it sounds like, I don't know, it sounds weird to say, but sometimes I just know. I'm like, here's what you should do. And somebody will go like, why? And I'll be like, I don't know. I just know this is what you should do. You know what I mean? And I'm sure of it, and I'm bad at articulating it, but it's probably because subconsciously or consciously or whatever, I've seen this similar situation so many times, it's just clicks and I just know. And you can't have that, in my opinion, after a short amount of time as opposed to somebody who's been effectively doing it their entire life.
Intuitive play isn't something you develop in a short period of time. And intuitive play is what clears the mental load for many of the elite players in the world. Remember when you first started playing and you had to consciously remind yourself to use an ability at the end step or during your upkeep? And sometimes you'd simply forget. But now that you've been playing for a while, you don't do that anymore. Your brain just reminds you to do it in the background, and you can spend the extra processing power on strategic elements of the game rather than not forgetting to do something. Since there are big parts of the game that they don't have to spend precious brain cycles on, our pros free them up for the really tough judgment calls and deeper lines of play. I asked Huey about the idea of trying hard as well. When we think of most endeavors, sheer effort is often rewarded, but is that true for mental games like Magic?
I think truthfully, it is true that you have to work hard to get better at things and be good at things. But a big part of Magic, a big part of the working hard, in quotes, is you're going to lose a lot. We're playing a game where, the best players of all time at the highest level have win rates of 61%. That's not very high. You're going to lose a lot of games and a lot of matches. If you want to get there, a big part of it is just sort of grinding through the losses. If you're the best player in the world, you're just not going to win that many tournaments, There are a couple outliers. Yeah, Kai won 7 Pro Tours. Good for him. Congrats, but it's just hard. You're going to have to be able to take your licks, and you're going to have to be able to get your, pick yourself back up and show up to the next event and not get affected by it. And you can go through losing streaks for a long time. It's really, really hard to go practice for a tournament for 2 weeks, invest your time and money for flights and hotels, show up to the tournament, lose 3 rounds quickly and just effectively be out. That's really hard on the psyche. It's really hard to deal with that. At some point, it's easy for people to just say, this is stupid, why do I bother? I should just give up, this is a waste of time. So, yes, you need to try hard, but also you need to just be mentally prepared to deal with the defeats, because they're frequent.
As you can see, the time spent in the trenches doing the whole hard work thing are used to build up multiple things. An intuition for the right play, a tolerance for losing, a more clear view of your strengths and weaknesses, and your fundamentals of strategic play, just to name a few. Huey thinks that evaluating oneself is one of the hardest, yet most important aspects of this process.
I think self-evaluation is a very underrated trait. One of the most underrated traits, undervalued maybe, traits in a human who's doing anything competitive. Because it's easy for me, okay? I can show up to a tournament, I can get mana screwed 4 times and go, oh well, I got unlucky, right? Sometimes it's very clear. When you play a game like Magic, it's very easy to blame luck. It's very easy for me to say, well, my draws were just bad. I had to mulligan twice. I kept a 1-lander that I had to keep. It's easy for people to blame luck. I'm not breaking through because I keep almost getting there and getting unlucky. Well, it's harder to say I keep almost getting there and then doing things that reduce my chances to win, and it's my fault. If I had just done better, I would be there. I do think there's a lot of variance, but also I do think, especially in people who aren't quite at the highest level, I find self-evaluation to be even more lacking. I think it's parabolic if you graft players by both success and by which level they're regularly playing at.
This sounded important to me, so I asked Huey to expand on it.
In fact, I think honestly sometimes people are overly self-evaluative. I think not that you could over self-evaluate, but I mean people are too timid when it comes to blaming luck. Sometimes I'll watch a game and someone will be like, "Oh, I could have done this." And I was like, "That would have been horrific." Yeah, because you drew this card and then he drew this card, it would have worked out, but no. You're being unreasonable.
I've seen this a lot myself. It's probably better to be too self-evaluative rather than not, but this is a trap that even the highest level pros fall for. So is hard work important? Absolutely. Don't be fooled by the cliched nature of the statement. The players at this level have all put in years of hard work. Some more deliberate than others, but in every case, the repetitions are there. To get to this level is very difficult, partially because you need to accept the huge amount of work you'll be putting in for what feels like small gains.
So it's really tough. You really have to dig in. You really have to understand, build your understanding. Sometimes it's hard. I always joke about how in Magic, it feels like you do so much work for so little gain to be really great, because if you just play Magic that way, where you follow the rules and you understand and, you don't make mistakes, you can still be good, and if you do all this extra work where you think all the time about all these incredibly difficult, counterintuitive, hard to calculate scenarios, you can build just on top of that, you can build like an extra maybe 5%, but that's everything. You know what I mean? 5% is what separates the best of all time, Finkel, Luis, from the rest of us. And 5% below that is what separates, the rest of us successful pros at 60, 61% win percentage lifetime, whatever, from, just good PTQ grinders who go to the Pro Tour and strike out consistently with their, 54% win percentage. So, this is what Magic is. You have to really think about everything and really try and understand all the counterintuitive spots and understand when to go against the rule and when to go with the rule and really delve into everything if you really want to be the best.
Wow. Let's let that sink in for a bit. Ben is saying that all of this extra work, all of this sacrifice and effort is about getting that extra 5%. That is a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? No wonder we tend to brush off advice like, you have to work really hard. When we face down what it actually means, what you actually have to do to satisfy this requirement, it's daunting. First, our guests are talking about how to get to the absolute peak of the game, while you are more likely concerned with getting to the next level beyond the one that you're at. And second, there's still one more section to cover today with our two elite pros, and it may be something you're not even aware of. So far, we've established that both a strong baseline intelligence level and long, sustained, focused effort are pillars of this process. While this doesn't come as a huge surprise, we delved into the details with our two pros and revealed some of the methods and ideas you can use to improve within this framework. For our final hypothesis, we're going to get into the real meat of what makes players of this level tick. After having talked for hours and hours with many top players about a variety of subjects, one consistent theme started to present itself. These players use critical thinking and logic rather than emotion to guide their decisions, and they're better than anyone at doing so. Organizing your thought process using this method requires the ability to work through complex logic puzzles quickly while also analyzing variables based on incomplete information, and all of this in real time. It is not easy. I asked Jensen how he uses critical thinking when he plays.
That's just all it is, man. That's all it is just thinking about everything and being, I don't know, in a literal sense, like all you're trying to do is think about what's happening and make the best decisions. And like I said, for me personally, I do think a lot of it is like, I've heard it described as like famous composers, Mozart or whatever, saw a piano and he could just play. I think at sometimes now I see a game and I can just play. Do you know what I mean? It's like a line from Good Will Hunting, honestly.
I know. I remember that.
It's literally a line from Good Will Hunting. But at this point, like I always try to think about stuff and evaluate situations. But I don't know. Like it's a weird question. Like how do you use critical thinking in Magic? I don't know. I guess I've never stopped and thought about it. But sort of that's all you're doing is critical thinking, right? When you're trying to play at the top level, like I was saying, even a 2-2 versus a 3-3, you just have to analyze 10, 12 levels on every decision that comes up.
Ben highlighted an important starting point. If you're going to succeed at the level that these players have, you're playing for one reason.
If we're talking tournament Magic, fun matters, of course. We all play this game because it's fun. But when we're talking about as a competitor in tournament Magic, the purpose of the game, the purpose of your plays, the purpose of the tournament and competing is to make whatever plays give yourself the highest chance at winning. So there's no other reason to be making a play in a game of Magic.
The important distinction Ben makes is not that you are playing to win the game, but that you are playing to give yourself the best chance of winning the game. The actual winning of games is essentially a byproduct of this approach. That's a strange way to look at it for most people who assume that your goal is to win, so you should be trying to win at all times. No, don't try to win. Try to give yourself the best percent at all decision points. That's where your energy is focused. Focusing on actually winning is an abstract and fruitless endeavor. This applies no matter how ahead or behind you are in a game, and no matter what the actual percent is.
Build your understanding of how to give yourself the highest win percentage in corner cases, in situations that deviate from the norm, so that when they come up, maybe you realize that path to victory and you're able to give yourself a 20% chance at winning instead of a 1%er. And that's really important because it's a game of narrow edges. It's a one-on-one game. You're not going to be a favorite that often. Even if you're a great player, you win 60, 65% of your matches. So that means there are a lot of positions in a lot of games where you're an underdog. And raising your chance at winning a game from 20 to 30% is winning that game 10% more often. Just like raising your percentage from 60 to 70% is winning that game 10% more often. So if you want to be one of the best Magic players and you have the ability to give yourself a 10% chance higher to win a game, it doesn't matter much whether it's from 20 to 30 or from 70 to 80. The point is you want to give yourself the highest chance to win the game. And you're not going to be a favorite that high of a percent of the time because it's a one-on-one game. Your opponent's trying to win also. So even if you're better than them, you can't think you're just always a favorite. You're always going to be in a favorable position because that means your opponent's always a dog. They're always in an unfavorable position. How is that possible? It's a one-on-one game. It's very important to always be focused on winning, whether you're behind or whether you're ahead. And when I say winning, giving yourself the highest chance to win, not being a favorite. In fact, being a favorite is such, I don't know the word for this, but it's such a bad concept because, if you're 49% and compared to 51, you're an underdog compared to a favorite, but that's just a 2% less chance at winning. This underdog side and favorite side don't mean very much. I don't even really know. I know what they mean, but I don't really understand how they apply, But you should never think a play doesn't matter because I'm still going to be an underdog, or a play, isn't good because I'm still going to be an underdog. Your focus should always be what gives me the highest chance to win this game. That's virtually the only reason to make a play in a game of Magic.
With that as a starting point, the next step is to address how to actually implement this logic. This is, of course, the hard part, and it's often oversimplified. I wanted to go a step further, so I asked Ben to sketch out what heuristics, methods, and tools he uses while he's actually playing the game. People often speak of something called a decision tree. This is a way to visualize the consequences of each of your options. I asked Ben if using the concept of columns was an accurate way to describe how he fundamentally approaches each decision. By columns, I mean each major decision during a turn gets its own column, and within that column, you have what you would do, what good things could or would happen as a result, and what bad things or potentially bad things would or could happen as well. You weigh each reasonable column against each other and eventually choose one. Ben breaks it down further.
Normally, when you start a turn, if you have what I would call reasonable choices, like I was trying to describe before, if you start a turn with two reasonable options, then you picture the whole turn. You picture, what's going to happen if I choose, option A? What's going to happen if I choose option B? What kind of a game does that leave me in? What are the possibilities that can go, if they have certain instance or things that will interfere with option A? What if they have those and I go with option B? And then you kind of you think okay, if they don't have anything, option A leaves me in this spot. How good is that for me? If they don't have anything, option B leaves me in this spot. How good is that for me? If they have card 1 that makes sense for them to have and is available here, where does that leave me with option A? What about if they have card 1? Where does that leave me if I make option B? What about card 2? Where does that leave me if I make, if I choose option A? What about card 2? Where does that leave me if I choose option B? And if I make that play, and then you kind of apply your big picture perspective of the game to those different board scenarios and exchanges, and there's a lot of complicated things at work. Like for example, anything that ever leaves you in a position where you just can't win either way, you completely discard, right? Like let's say if they have card 1. You envision what happens if you take option A and it's just awful for you. You have virtually no chance to win, right? Let's say if they have card 1, you envision what happens if you take option B and it's just awful for you and you have virtually no way to win. And then you quickly think, do I have option C? No, not really. These are the only two reasonable plays against a total set of things. At that point, card 1 is unbeatable, basically. So now card 1 doesn't exist. Like, now you say to yourself, okay, what are my options if they don't have anything? How does option A and option B stack up against them having nothing? And how does option A and option B stack up against them having card 2? And card 1, they can't have because it doesn't exist. Of course, they could have it. They may very well have it and play it and beat you, but you can't beat everything. That's not how Magic works. So when you encounter a situation where there's a card that's just devastating for you and you have no good lines to beat, then you don't want to tailor your play to do the most against that card. Let's say, for example, you could make a play in the scenario I just described, option C, that gave you a 5% chance to beat this card that was absolutely devastating and just was basically accomplished so much less than option A or B. That's why you hadn't considered it before, against virtually everything else, against card 2 they could have, or against them having nothing. Unless you know this card is in their hand, or unless it's extremely, extremely likely this card is in their hand. Like, every play they've made this whole game means they have to have this card or whatever. You just play Magic like this card does not exist, because you want your play to be the best against a total set of cards. If you have to make a play that's so extreme against this one card that you don't even have any real reason to think they're holding, it's just a possible card they could have, that your game plan just ends up, you're just awful against everything else and still awful against this, then why are you, what are you doing? You know what I mean? You're just throwing away tons of win percentage because you don't want to auto lose to something. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have to lose to things. People don't have everything. You don't want to try and beat every possible card your opponent can have, You want to make the play that's best against, what they definitely have, which is what's in play and everything, and then consider what they're likely to have. So if you can't beat a card, it doesn't exist. If a card is too devastating for you, it doesn't exist. And when it does exist, when they have it, you just shake their hand and say good game.
Here, Ben really focuses in on the concept of trying to make the best percentage play rather than trying to just win. If you take the line of just winning here, you give up a big chunk of win percentage. Ben also gives us a great example of critical thinking being applied to the game. You'll notice how dryly the logic is applied. There isn't any mention of how you feel about any of this, even though we all know the feeling of losing at Magic. It sucks. It feels bad, and we want to avoid it. Yet, as Ben describes here, there are times when losing is inevitable. This is just a fact, and playing in a way that tries to ignore that may feel better in the moment, but it does not beget a higher win percentage in the long run. So we don't do it, we ignore that option, and when it happens, we accept our loss and we move on to the next match. Jensen gives us another example of divorcing your feelings from the decisions when I asked him about why people concede when they still have a few win percentage left in the game.
Part of this, and I've done this, and I get really mad at myself. Do you know why people do that? It's a human characteristic that when you're feeling pain or anguish, you want it to end, right? So if you're sitting there playing a game, if you're playing against a control deck, and you're going to lose, and it's going to take 15 minutes, you don't want to suffer for 15 minutes knowing you're going to lose. You just want it to be over. It's like when things just can't get worse, it doesn't matter. I don't know. That's what it is, though. It's just that, like, people don't want to sit there and have to wait 10 minutes feeling horrible, because losing feels horrible if you care. Losing just feels awful. It's almost the worst feeling, within reason. And so you can sit there just knowing you're going to lose, drawing every card as a formality, or you can just concede and you just don't feel so bad anymore. It's over. Like, knowing you're going to lose is almost worse than having lost. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what it is. It's that people... And like I said, I've done this before, and I get really mad at myself. But it's like, because people are just weak. People have moments of weakness. I do it. Everybody's done it. And when it's like, I know I'm going to lose, just let me be done with this. Concede. And then it's like, what am I doing? Like, maybe 1 in 10,000 I win. Why would I do this to myself? Suck it up and tough out the 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. It's game 3, whatever, Well, that's what it is.
Emotions have come up a few times now as humans are traditionally poor at being purely logical. Fear, anxiety, pride, excitement, stubbornness, and even doubt are just some of the factors that can cloud clear judgment.
I think emotions are pretty big, actually. I think in some people, it's like anything else. I actually think that's a big part of experience in a tournament, too. I think if you take Ben, for example, Ben or me or John, I don't think emotions are likely to play a big role in a tournament. Now, on the flip side, if you take somebody who's playing a match for their first top 8, I am so close to just reaching this thing that I've devoted my life to. Like, that's a lot of pressure. Like, if I fail right now, if I come up short right now, I might never have another chance for this to happen to me. Like, this is it. It's probably the same as, a professional football player playing in his first Super Bowl against Tom Brady. Tom Brady's just like, whatever. Like, I've been here before. I'm here again. I'll be here again next year. And I don't, I want to win, but I'm not nervous. Some people don't react well to getting unlucky. I think people feel like, whatever, like there's a lot of luck in Magic. That's how it is. Sometimes you keep really good hands with 2 lands and you don't draw anymore. Or sometimes you keep really good hands with 4 lands and you only draw lands. I mean, that's what we signed up for. It's going to happen. When it happens, suck it up, get over it, and do your best you can to win the next round.
Ah, yes, getting unlucky. It's a byproduct of randomness in our game, of variance. When it comes to emotions, nothing in our game stirs them up like a good old variance. This is where many players tend to tilt. That means play suboptimally because of perceived bad luck, and it's a major issue for many players. We've all seen or experienced it. You're doing well, far ahead of your opponent, then they draw exactly the card they needed to beat you. You just got top-decked. Feels bad, man. Or you just had a great 2-land hand against an opponent with a deck that you think is bad, but you never draw your 3rd land and you end up losing. Then in the next game, you make play mistakes you normally wouldn't because you're still frustrated about how the prior game went. You are tilting and it's costing you equity. How do our 2 Hall of Famers see variance, luck, and all that? We'll start with Ben.
I don't really think much about the variance. It's just something you have to accept as part of why Magic is great. The variance itself is certainly not what makes Magic great. Losing games because your opponent hits a 3%er or winning games because you hit a 3%er is not great in my opinion. What's great about Magic is the in-depth strategy of constantly trying to position yourself to have the highest chance of winning that's possible. If you set yourself up with a 97% chance to win and then you don't win, or you set yourself up with a 3% chance to win and then you do win, neither of those things is great. What's great is if you gave yourself the highest chance to win at all points. Whether or not it actually happens after that is outside of your control. That's the variance, and that's just part of the game.
He makes it sound so easy, but he's right. And we've hit on a concept you absolutely must embrace if you're going to be great at this game. You must fully accept that some things are out of your control and that you'll lose regardless of the correctness of your actions. That's not the fight you're trying to fight. Still, even a pro like Ben has to get frustrated sometimes, right?
Not really. I mean, if it's a particularly big moment, maybe you feel a little something, but in reality, our opponents have been mana screwed just as much as we have. Our opponents have top decked just as much as we have. I think players who are, feeling bad or frustrated or whatnot when they keep a 2-lander and they don't get to land 3 are just not appreciating all the times it's happened to their opponents. And like I said, that's not the good part of Magic, but it's a necessary part of it. So for me, I get frustrated when I give myself a 30% chance to win, when I could have made a different play that was correct, that would have given myself an 80% chance to win based on the information I had, when I misplay, when I cost myself. I don't really get frustrated because of the order cards come out of my deck at random. Like, what are you even mad at? You're mad at your library? It's a deck of playing cards. You're mad at luck? Luck isn't a person. Like, luck didn't deliberately do this to you, You're mad at variance? Like, these are abstract concepts. Like, it doesn't really make sense to me to get mad about the variance, like, ever. To me, it only makes sense to worry about the parts you can control. And, I do get frustrated and mad and tilt a little bit, at myself if I punt a game, if I play poorly, because you put a lot of practice, a lot of hard work, a lot of time and energy into going to compete in a Magic tournament, and if I come up short on the variance side, it just wasn't my day. I'm not mad at myself. I prepared well, I played well, and the variance just wasn't with me that day, and maybe next time it will be. If I play poorly, then, the variance didn't cost me, this inanimate object that it makes no sense to be mad at. I cost me. And now I have someone to be mad at. You know what I mean? When I cost myself, I have someone to be upset with. When it's the variance, it's okay. Like, it's not, I would rather be lucky every tournament I played. I would rather have, the best luck every tournament, but that's just not how variance and luck and math work. You just accept the variance. It's part of why Magic's a great game, but it itself is not what makes Magic great, and then you just focus on the parts you can control, your own decisions and your own play.
This is a major takeaway. It's so much more difficult to actually do for most people than it sounds, but it's absolutely critical to success to be able to truly focus on your own decisions and play and not to focus on variance or bad luck. Those things even out over the long run with all players. Play skill does not. A lot of what we've talked about today comes down to taking responsibility for your own self rather than blaming outside factors. One way this manifests is when people look to others to make decisions for them rather than taking responsibility for themselves.
Some people are trying to be told what to do, like given a checklist of strategy. And that's just not how it works. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, people don't ask why. People say, I listened to Limited Resources and Marshall said to take this card over this card. So it comes to pack 3 and they take this card over this card. But it's like, that's right, but it's not right here. So they're like, rather than saying, why does Marshall say to take this card over this card? Oh, because, this is one of the most efficient creatures in the format. And the other card, is a removal spell, but there's a lot of removal in the format. So we're prioritizing efficient creatures here. So Marshall says, take the efficient creature over the removal spell, which is right. But then in pack 3, our whole deck is efficient creatures and we have no removal spells, right? So people are going, well, I did what I was supposed to do. I took the efficient creature over the removal spell. And it's like, no, what you need to do is ask yourself why. Before you just do what I say or do what Marshall says or do what Luis says or whomever you like to read or watch, ask yourself, why did we say to do that? Does that still apply here? If it does, go ahead. But if it doesn't, don't. And I think that's sort of like, I think that's a big difference between even like the sort of the middle and the lower level players. I think the more you ask why, the higher up you're going to climb, because I do believe if your goal is to be the best, at some point you have to accept you might be on par with the best and make your own decisions. Not that like you should disregard other people's opinions, but sometimes also we are wrong. You're wrong, I'm wrong, Luis is wrong, whatever. It's just life. And Magic can't be played with a checklist card. You can't just say, all right, turn 1, do this. Turn 2, do this. It doesn't work. You have to just process what's going on and make sure you know why you're doing things. And if people just stopped and asked themselves, why am I going to do this? Even when it seems obvious, I bet you'd be surprised how many fewer mistakes you would make.
When covering strategic theory like this, you may ask yourself, well, how do I actually apply all of this to the game? Clearly, doing this well is a complex endeavor, but is there any kind of framework you can use to help you along the way? We've talked about the idea of columns a little earlier, and now we'll go a step further, and we're going to talk about transactions, the factors, and the variables you need to be able to assess and apply, and how to go about doing that. First, I asked Huey about which factors to consider while playing.
How do you decide which factors to consider?
Just consider them all, man.
Really?
Try.
Insane. And don't you just get tired?
Yeah.
I pressed for specifics.
The number of variables that he or she uses just gradually declines. Do you know what I mean? From Owen to the average casual player. Like, even in this situation as simple as a 2-2 attacking into a 3-3, Owen might use 10 variables, tier down to 8, 6, 4, 2, to a completely new player, he or she might use 0.
Might use 0 or 1.
Or 1. There's no variable. 3-3, 2-2 block. No variable, And which is fine. Everybody starts somewhere. I'm just saying.
So you think that you're actually, when you're in a game, you're actually taking on much more as far as possibilities, different things?
I think so, yeah. I think I've just, over time learned all the nuances of things that can matter in making even basic decisions.
So it's not just about being able to put these factors and variables into a framework. It's also about developing the skill set to expand the number of variables that you're plugging into your system. I asked Ben if Magic could be broken down into a series of smaller equity decisions that results in a bigger picture of a high win percentage.
Every decision point can be considered an individual transaction, I guess. I'm viewing the decision points as, I could attack here, and it does something positive, and also it does something negative, right? And that would be the individual transactions. Like, if I attack with this creature, I deal 3 damage, the creature is not available to block. So there's tons of those or whatever. And then you also have, the big picture, which I think it allows you to make the counterintuitive plays. I think if you're always focused on the individual decision, like if you're like, okay, if I attack here with this creature, it's going to do 3 points of damage. My opponent's going to attack me back for 2. 3 is more than 2. I should attack. If that's your whole thought process, you're only thinking about that individual transaction and not the big picture. You're never going to be able to not attack in that spot when it's not correct for you to deal 3 to the opponent in exchange for taking 2 back. And if your deck has a much more powerful late game than the opponent's, and you have even good cards in hand, a great hand, one of the only ways the opponent may be able to beat you is by getting in the 20 damage before you can kind of deploy your whole late game. So it could easily be incorrect for you to deal 3 to them in exchange for taking 2 back. So I think that you should always be thinking bigger picture and then applying the big picture to each individual transaction and then coming up with what's best for you.
Ben's really getting into the nitty-gritty here, and I don't know about you, but I'm loving it. Basically, there's a combination of small individual transactions, but also they need to be applied under the umbrella of a bigger overall game plan. But what about the actual variables you are plugging in? How do you know how much weight to put on one variable or another if you're working with incomplete information? Are these just essentially educated guesses?
Yeah, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. They're estimates. When I say, when I'm making those columns and plugging those variables and I say to myself, I think, I can be 7% against a card, I don't have a high degree of confidence that it's 7%. If you told me even I was off substantially, if you told me I could be 10% against that card by making that play and not 7%, I wouldn't be surprised. The calculations are very tough and you're not actually doing them in those spots in most cases. Some cases the calculations aren't that complicated, even though the scenario might be, like if you make this play and they have this card, you end up on 1 out or whatever. And then you can obviously do the calculations, because if you have 1 turn at 1 out and 30 cards in your deck, then you're roughly 3% to hit. In terms of doing those calculations, you're virtually never doing them. It's an estimate. If you use the correct framework and you understand Magic and you understand the scenarios, you make estimates, I think, as far as how devastating it is for you if they have different things, or how good it is for you, for example. It doesn't have to be devastating. You might be 90% to win the game if they have nothing, and 80% to win the game if they have card 1, and 70% to win the game if they have card 2 by your estimation. But these estimations are going to drive your play because, of course, we all should want the same thing. If we're talking about tournament Magic, and we all want the highest chance to win every game. So every time you make a play, you're making it only for the reason because you think it gives you the highest chance to win. There's no other reason, I don't think, to make a play in a game of Magic. This particular play may be in conjunction with later plays or later draws or what have you to give you the highest chance at winning. But it's the reason that you're making this play is never for style points. It's never
right.
It's never to rub it into the opponent, to rub the opponent's face in the dirt. You're making this play because it gives you the highest chance to win the game. So you make your you build your columns like you described. You think through the possibilities and you sort them out, and you make your estimates based on what your chances are like, given what they have and what they could have based on what's reasonable for the scenario. And if everyone uses the proper framework, the player who makes the most accurate estimates and then the best play based on those estimates is going to be the best player.
Let's zoom out for just a minute here. We're talking about smaller transactions that add up to wins, but also grouping these transactions under the framework of a bigger picture strategy. Here, Ben gives us a great example of applying one of the bigger picture strategies.
If you're ahead, let's say you're in a position where you're just crushing on board and there's no, real big haymakers available to the opponent. then you need to be thinking no longer, what is my path to victory? But you need to be thinking almost exclusively, what is their path to victory? Because with no real game changers, you don't need to deal them. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to deal them the most damage you can deal them this turn, or you don't need to get the best resource exchange you can get this turn, or you don't need to accomplish any one thing. What you need to accomplish, the thing you need to be looking at is what do they need to accomplish to win this game? How can I deny them that? Because if you're up so much, there's going to be very limited paths to victory for your opponent. But if you're not thinking about them, then they can sometimes catch you by surprise with that one or two paths to victory that were available to them. But if you're thinking about them and you identify that one or two paths to victory that might be available to your opponent, the only one or two, then you can often make plays that cut those off and don't really open you up to anything else because you're in such a commanding position. Whereas when it's a really tight game, you can't be thinking like that because your opponent isn't that likely to have that exact path, those exact cards. And if you make plays to, specifically big sacrifices or specific plays to get around those paths, you just open up other paths, new paths that they wouldn't have had. The more you're up, the more you need to think about closing the available paths that your opponent could have. And the more you're behind, the less you can worry about what your opponent's paths to victory are, and the more you need to be trying to figure out what possible paths to victory you have so that you can make the exact set of plays that gives you this one path to victory. And by that, I mostly mean cards you can draw and stuff like that. Maybe you're getting crushed on board, but if you make a couple very exact plays, you can then top deck this one or two cards in your deck over the next couple turns, let's say. And if you do, and they don't have anything else, then you win the game. And you're being crushed on board, So you give yourself, and if you're talking about maybe a 2-outer over, several turns and you have a 30-card library, we're not talking about something 1% to happen here. We're talking about something 10, 15% to happen. So when you identify this path in this game you're getting crushed, and then you make some maybe not obvious plays because they give you this one specific path to victory, you give yourself a 15%er in a game where if you just kept going the norm, just going, making positive trades, trading 3 for 2 but not 2 for 3, etc. If you stuck with that and those cards wouldn't work, you might be roughly 0% to win this game. So the further you are behind, the more you should be trying to identify specific paths to victory and being willing to make bigger sacrifices in order to hit those paths, to put yourself on them. And the more you are ahead, then of course the reverse of that is true. The more your opponent should be looking for very specific paths to victory, and the more your opponent may need to make big sacrifice to put themselves on that. And so from your perspective, the more you want to cut off any possible paths to victory from your opponent. So as you get further and further ahead, you're thinking, what are my opponent's possible paths to victory? And when you get further and further behind, you're thinking, what are my possible paths to victory? And when you're in close games, you just want to generally be doing the plays that accomplish the most, because if you make specific plays to close one path, it probably just opens up other ones because it's a close game and there's a ton of possible paths to victory.
We have now gotten pretty deep into the nitty-gritty of the mechanics of critical thinking and applying logic for Magic. We've taken a look at how to frame your approach using columns and plugging in variables and then weighing those against each other, while also taking the further step of addressing how to look at and weigh the individual variables and transactions within this framework, all while disregarding pesky human emotion as much as possible to make the best possible decision for maximum equity. And you thought Magic was about dragons and angels. This is the method and level of depth that you need to get to if you want to be one of the best. All of the best players have a similar outlook on the game, nearly without exception. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this, don't worry, you aren't alone. Many of us are attracted to endeavors like Magic for this exact reason. They have a very high ceiling. Whenever you feel like you've leveled up, you realize how much further you actually have to go. Now, you've had a glimpse into the minds of the absolute pinnacle of the game. As it turns out, the peak level is really, really high up there. In order to get there, you'll have to really let it sink in that you have a long way to go before you reach this level. I know you might be the best player in your local store, or maybe you're the PTQN boss for your area, but you have to learn to let your ego go and to say, I don't know.
But most people they care a lot about how they're perceived and they want to be right. And it's a lot harder sometimes to admit you're wrong than it is to accept you're wrong. Like people sort of know they're wrong and they're like, I'm going to argue this now to save face rather than because I think I'm right. And it actually, I think, creates a huge, huge detriment.
Do you respect somebody more if they can tell you?
Oh, yeah. Like, I believe, I think everybody does it to some degree. And part of it is because, people just think they're right or they wouldn't argue things. But I think somebody who says like, oh, you know what? Actually, you're right. I didn't think about this, this, and this. That's a really good point. It's like, okay, like this is somebody I want to converse with. You know what I mean? Somebody else who's like, well, whatever, you can just think whatever you want. I'll think what I want. It's like, well, obviously I can think whatever I want. You can think whatever you want. That's not helpful.
Along with being humble in the name of improving, you'll have to be able to take feedback and actually use it.
I think one of the main things that I see differently are people are very results oriented. I think it's really bad to be results oriented. I feel like a lot of people are afraid to explain why they do things because they might be wrong or something. And that's an area that I differ from a lot of people. I don't mind being wrong. I'd rather be right, but I'd rather learn if I'm wrong and correct it than never find out. I think a lot of people have this completely irrational, frankly, fear of being wrong or something. And it's, if you're doing something wrong, that's hurting you. If you don't explain it to people so nobody knows it, you're going to keep doing it, and that's going to keep hurting you. If you have that discussion with people and you explain your thought process and you're wrong, your logic is bad, you don't understand the scenario, and your friends give you this feedback, hey man, your logic here is bad, you're wrong, you don't understand the scenario, here's how you should be thinking about it. And maybe you feel that slight moment of embarrassment, but once you get past that and you correct it and fix it, now for the long run, you're not making those mistakes anymore. So now, your friends have just helped you. You've learned from that exchange, and now your life or your win percentage in Magic is better for it. So I think you should always try and get rid of your ego. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Even the very best Magic players make mistakes. You can go ask, John Finkel or, Kai Booty or Luis Scott-Vargas if they've ever made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes in Magic. It's really hard. Just check your ego at the door. Accept that you're making mistakes. When you think you might have made a mistake or there might have been a scenario that you didn't understand or something, ask people, tell them your thought process, get feedback. And if you were wrong, instead of being embarrassed or shying away from that, embrace it and just try and develop your skills so that you don't, repeat the same mistakes. And frankly, I think if people apply that to life and as well as Magic, the world would be much better.
I've given you a lot to process here. We've covered the big picture. We've gone deep into the details of what makes the best players in our game tick. Now, I asked both of our guests to kind of give us a summary. Let us know what it is that they think is essential to the way that they approach the game and that they would give as advice to you.
Identify any areas that you might be not as good as possible in. You need to ask people to watch your games, people you respect. You should probably watch content from the best players and then don't watch them to see what sweet thing happens. Watch them and think about what you would do at all times. And then when they do something differently than what you would do, think to yourself, why did they do that? Assume that, they're probably right, but even though you may be right, just think about what would cause them to do that. Because if it's the complex calculations, the point is not for you to be right or for them to be right. The point is to understand the scenario. So you want to think what caused them to make this play that's different from what I would have made. Are there cards in play? Are there cards in their deck? Are there cards the opponent could have that they're valuing into their, intuitive math that I wouldn't have? Because they're making this play for reasons most of the time. And you want to learn and you want to be able to think through each situation well. So it's not necessarily even about, am I right or am I wrong? It's about learning. It's about what possible reasons led them to make this play. So you always want to be thinking about that. You always want to be thinking, what are the reasons? How can I learn? Get coaching, get feedback, watch content, think about everything. Just always try to improve. Always try and always analyze your own game. Always analyze yourself. The most important thing is to develop your skills as best as possible.
If you could just break every decision down into percentage, just imagine every decision is a tree. and do your best to quantify with a number the percent you are to win the game with every decision. And that'll help you in situations. It helps you in a lot of situations. It helps you in situations where you're way ahead. Sometimes the decision trees don't matter a lot, right? Like sometimes I'm 99% to win the game if I make play A and 98% to win the game if I make play B. Well, guess what? 1 in 100 times if I make play B, I cost myself the game. So you don't feel it, but if you think about it, you won't do it. It's like the one time it does happen, you think back and go like, oh yeah, I was playing sloppy because I was so far ahead. I could have just made play B and this wouldn't have been a problem. But now it is a problem because I was playing too fast and I didn't ask myself why I was doing what I'm doing. And I think that's basically it. I think if you just actually just make sure you're doing what you're doing in the context of a game of Magic or even outside the game and preparing or whatever for the right reasons, I think that's the best advice I could give.
And this episode has been the best advice that I can give you. As you level up through the game, these are the people you want to emulate. This thought process, this approach, this is how the very best players in the world play our game. Now, the challenge lies with you. Only you can push yourself, can challenge yourself to be on this level. Will you do it? All right, that was it. That was the first ever post-produced episode of Limited Resources, and I told you at the beginning that I'd give you a little bit of behind the scenes, and I will. So basically, when I listen to podcasts or I think about podcasts, there's two different types. There's conversational and there are post-produced. And conversational is what Limited Resources is. And in fact, many of my favorite podcasts are conversational. I feel like they lend a more warm tone and they're more fun. They're more spontaneous. Luis and I like to play off of each other, have fun, tease each other. All that stuff goes away if you're writing it, right? It's just not, you lose that whole vibe. And it also plays to our strengths, I think. So that's why LR is and will be a conversational podcast. But some of the most popular, most successful podcasts in the world, I'm not talking about Magic, I mean in general, think, NPR, 99% Invisible, Radiolab, these type of ones, they are post-produced, heavily post-produced. Like 6 to 7 people make these things. And the basic way it works is real simple. You go out, you interview people, you get audio footage from them, and then you tell a story using the audio footage. So you often will just write it. It'll read like a journalistic article, but instead of seeing quotes from people, you get to actually hear from them. And it lets you go deeper. It lets you make a more profound point and get really into the nitty gritty that is a little harder when you're in the moment and it can kind of slip by. And so that's what I wanted to do. That was what this was me wanting to do this. And I actually recorded that audio almost 2 years ago, and I've been working on it since. Now, I'm not saying I've been working on it every day. I've ran into multiple roadblocks that sort of stumbled me and made me put it aside for a while, and then I'd come back and get inspired to do it again. But it's hard. I knew it was going to be though, because if you listen to the end of those podcasts, the ones I mentioned, they have an editor, a producer, music, mixing. They have the person doing the recording and they have the host. It's just so many different people that go in to make one of these. And I wanted to do it all myself. And the reason for that is because I wanted to learn each step of the process for myself, even though it's really not optimal to do it on your own. And I knew that. So in my mind, I thought, well, what's the outlet? The outlet is time. My worst case scenario is that it takes me a really long time to do it, but I'll get it done. And that's exactly what happened. It took a really long time to do it, but I got it done. And I want to know what you think. I hope you liked it. I really hope you liked it. I hope it didn't suck. I would be really bummed if it sucked. If it was just fine, I can probably live with that as my first shot at it. But I really liked making it, and I really liked what those guys had to say. I thought they really brought their A game, and I thought that was really cool. And I learned a lot. So first things first, again, I want to say thank you to our patrons and to Channel Fireball for supporting the show and making it possible for me and for the show to reach out in new directions like this. This is a labor-intensive thing that took some equipment, time, editing. I needed a lot of resources to make this thing come together, and I wouldn't have those without Patreon and Channel Fireball. So thank you to our supporters there. You really, really mean a lot. Seriously, the ability to push into new directions is really important, I think, for a show like this, and that's the only reason we can do it. This episode was recorded, edited, mixed, and written by me, but of course, nothing comes together all by yourself, and I had a lot of help as well. So I wanted to thank a few people for helping me put this thing together. First and foremost, of course, are our 2 Hall of Famers and 1 world champion, William Huey Jensen, and of course, Ben Stark, for taking the time out of their day in the summer and sitting down with me and really giving us the goods. I mentioned it a minute ago, but my God, they were great. I was going through, and the way that I ended up making this was I tried to do it all in the editor, and I just couldn't get it visualized correctly. So I ended up writing it. I transcribed every word of everything that we did. It ended up being, 15,000 words or something, but I got to listen to it all again and again and again. And I was just continually blown away by some of the insight that those 2 brought. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Huey. You guys were awesome for this and really drove me to make me want to make this, because honestly, I just didn't want to let the awesome material that they gave us go away. I wanted to make sure that it got into the hands of the people that wanted it the most, which is, of course, you, the listener. Also, thank you to some people that just helped me along the way with advice, maybe some inspiration, that kind of thing to help me put this thing together. So thank you to Adam Scher, Woodrow Engel, Ryan Spain, James Turner, Gabby Sparts, Graham Stark, Maria Bartholdi, Rosa Johnsich, and Brian David Marshall. I bounce ideas off of a lot of people for all of my stuff, for the YouTube channel, for limited resources and all that stuff. And these are just a few of the people that I hit up for ideas and inspiration to get this thing done. So I do want to know what you think. I really do. This thing was a ton of work, but the second one I think would be way easier. I just don't know if it's worth it for me to do them. If it hit you hard and it was really good, then it probably is. And if it was like, yeah, that was pretty cool, but when's our regular show? Then I probably won't, right? Just given the amount of effort that it takes. So let me know. I am curious if you learned anything from the episode and if you enjoyed it. And that would be really helpful for me. But speaking of the show, it'll be back to its normal schedule next week. Luis is going to be back in action, he told me, and I'm looking forward to it. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.